Godfrey Harrington West emerged from the drawing room as Whimsy divested himself of his overcoat. A man of perhaps 55 years with a sort of face that suggested he had spent his life in mild bewilderment at the world's general refusal to conform to his expectations. His hair, still predominantly dark, had begun its retreat from his temples with the desperation of a defeated general. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from grief or sleeplessness, or perhaps the rather more prosaic irritation of dust, remained to be determined. "Whimsy," Godfrey said, extending a hand that trembled with barely suppressed emotion, or perhaps merely the effects of a strong whiskey, consumed rather too early in the day. "Thank God you've come. This has all been perfectly dreadful, absolutely ghastly. So one gathers from your telegram, which was admirably terse," Whimsy replied, shaking the proffered hand with the correct degree of sympathetic firmness. "I collect that a Beatrice has expired under circumstances deemed suspicious by yourself, if not yet by the constabulary. Before we proceed to the particulars, might I impose upon your hospitality for a moment? The drive has left me with a certain desiccation of the throat, and I find that one investigates murder more effectively when not suffering from the preliminary stages of dehydration." Godfrey, rather clearly attempting to determine whether Whimsy was displaying appropriate gravity or engaged in some form of elaborate jest, led him toward the drawing-room, where a decanter of sherry sat upon a side table with an air of weary resignation. The room itself was the sort of space that suggested expensive decoration undertaken without genuine conviction. The furniture was correct, the paintings respectable, the carpet adequate, yet the overall effect was rather like a stage set executed with mechanical precision. Whimsy accepted the proffered glass and seated himself in a wing-back chair, positioned with a clear view of the doorway. A useful habit, acquired during the war, and never quite abandoned. "Now then," he commenced, once the sherry had been assessed and found marginally acceptable, "suppose you furnish me with the essential facts. Not the speculation, if you please. Merely the observable sequence of events. Who was Beatrice? How did she expire? And what specific aspect of her demise has prompted this conviction of foul play?" Godfrey settled himself upon the sofa with the air of a man preparing to deliver a theatrical monologue he had not adequately rehearsed. "Beatrice was my wife," he began, and Whimsy noted the use of past tense with the careful precision of someone trained to observe such linguistic choices. "Married for 28 years this past June. She was not a young woman, you understand, 52 years of age, but in reasonably good health, or so I believed. No cardiac complaints, no respiratory difficulties, nothing that would suggest—" He trailed off, reaching for his own glass with the desperation of a man seeking external fortification. "The medical particulars, if you would," Whimsy interjected gently. "When did the decease occur?" "Last night. Between 9:30 and 11 o'clock, the physician estimates. She retired early, complained of a headache. Nothing unusual in that. Beatrice was prone to migraines. I remained downstairs reading until nearly midnight, then came up to bed and found her—" Godfrey's voice cracked slightly. "Found her quite cold. The physician was summoned immediately, and he confirmed that she had been deceased for some hours, and the circumstances that have prompted suspicion of foul play. Surely a woman of 52 expiring from natural causes in her own bed is hardly extraordinary. However lamentable." Godfrey leaned forward, his eyes acquiring that peculiar intensity that comes from the collision of shock and inexplicable certainty. "Because she would not have done it voluntarily, Whimsy. And because of the shutter—" "Ah," said Whimsy, his eyebrow elevating with interest. "The shutter, the one on the eastern face, third window from the corner, currently standing ajar in a manner suggestive of neither accident nor design. Do elaborate. You noted it already?" Godfrey appeared simultaneously relieved and unsettled. "That is Beatrice's bedroom. Our bedroom, rather. The shutter was firmly closed when I dressed this morning. I remember noticing it particularly because I remarked to myself that the cold had set in rather severely overnight. But when I entered the room after discovering her body, the shutter was open. How it came to be opened, I cannot fathom. The window itself was closed and locked from the interior. The curtains had been drawn. I drew them myself last night before retiring, and Beatrice would never have opened it. She despised drafts. Whimsy set down his sherry glass with deliberate care. You found her dead, discovered the shutter open, and immediately concluded foul play rather than, say, a restless sleep state or a servant's overzealous housekeeping. Because, Godfrey said quietly, the physician found a peculiar discoloration around her mouth and nostrils, a faint but unmistakable blue-gray tinge. He became quite guarded when I asked about it, but his expression suggested he suspected poisoning, or perhaps— He hesitated. Perhaps asphyxiation. Whimsy rose from his chair and moved toward the window, his gaze distant and contemplative. The shutter remained visible from this vantage point, that singular accent of disorder against the orderly facade of the house. When he spoke, his voice held the quality of someone thinking aloud rather than addressing an author. A person. How very peculiar indeed. A locked window, an open shutter, a dead woman with suspicious discoloration, and a husband who observes details with admirable precision. One begins to suspect that Tuesday has revealed itself considerably more interesting than anticipated. He turned back to Godfrey with a smile that was sharp enough to draw blood. Might I examine the bedroom? And do tell me, has anyone else entered that room since the discovery? Godfrey rose with the alacrity of a man grateful for any action that might forestall further examination of his emotional state. The physician, Dr. Mallory, remained for perhaps 20 minutes after confirming death. The local inspector, a man named Gresham, arrived shortly thereafter and conducted what he termed a preliminary survey. Beyond that, only the housemaid who discovered the body has entered, and the housekeeper briefly to ensure the windows were secure. I gave orders that no one else was to disturb the room. How conscientious of you, Whimsy observed, retrieving his overcoat with a fluid motion that suggested he had never truly divested himself of the investigative impulse, though one might argue that locking the stable door after the horse has expired somewhat diminishes the exercise. Still, we shall make do with what remains. Lead on, dear fellow. Let us ascend to this chamber of domestic mystery. The staircase was broad and well-appointed, the sort of architectural feature designed to impress visitors whilst simultaneously announcing the financial security of the household. Whimsy ascended with an air of scholarly detachment, his eyes cataloguing details with the precision of a man trained to observe what others merely saw. A water stain on the upper landing ceiling, damp from the autumn rains likely. A framed landscape painting whose frame sat marginally askew, the work of servants during their weekly. Cleaning, almost certainly. A faint indentation in the carpet runner, suggesting the recent movement of furniture, or perhaps merely the accumulated weight of years. The master bedroom occupied the eastern face of the house, precisely as Whimsy had deduced from his observation of the exterior. It was a room of considerable size, furnished in the manner that suggested someone, probably a London decorator engaged at considerable expense, had attempted to create an impression of tasteful restraint. The result was competent but rather sterile, like viewing the photograph of an emotion rather than experiencing the emotion itself. The bed, a substantial affair of mahogany with an elaborate headboard, dominated the chamber. Upon it lay the mortal remains of Beatrice Harrington West, arranged with a propriety that suggested either exceptional consideration on the part of whoever had discovered her, or the interference of someone attempting to present a particular narrative. She was attired in a pale blue nightgown of silk, her hands positioned across her abdomen in an attitude of repose. Her hair, still dark with only modest grey threading, was arranged against the pillow with a neatness that struck Whimsy as oddly deliberate. It was her face, however, that commanded his attention. Even in death there was a peculiar quality to the countenance, a slight distortion of the features, as though the muscles had contracted with considerable force before finally surrendering to the inevitable. Her lips bore precisely the discoloration that Godfrey had mentioned, a faint but unmistakable blue-grey tinge that extended faintly toward her nostrils. Her eyes, though closed, appeared to have sunken slightly into their sockets, which was consistent with a certain class of poisonings, but equally consistent with natural expiration over an extended period. The physician examined her thoroughly? Whimsy inquired, moving about the room with the careful precision of a man engaged in some elaborate choreography. Superficially, Godfrey replied. He took her pulse, confirmed the absence of respiration, noted the discoloration, and recommended that a post-mortem examination be conducted. Inspector Gresham seemed disinclined to pursue the matter aggressively until the coroner's verdict is rendered. Wimsey nodded absently, his attention now fixed upon the window in question. The frame was indeed locked from the interior, the mechanism robust and well-maintained. The curtains, heavy damask of a cream color that must have cost someone a considerable sum, were drawn across the panes. He reached out and opened them with deliberate care, revealing the window beyond and, more significantly, the open shutter visible from the exterior. "Curious," he murmured. "Most curious indeed. The lock is engaged, yet someone, or some force, has managed to open the shutter whilst leaving the window itself sealed. That suggests either mechanical manipulation from the exterior or the intervention of an individual with access to this chamber who possessed knowledge of the locking mechanism." He examined the window frame with meticulous attention, running his fingers along the wood and testing the sill for any signs of disturbance or external tampering. The paint was undisturbed, the mechanism unmarred. He opened the window cautiously and leaned out slightly, surveying the exterior wall and the curious angle of the shutter below. "I observe," he commenced, withdrawing his head and closing the window with the same careful precision, "that the shutter hinge is in perfect working order. There is no rust, no corrosion, no indication of disuse. Yet it appears to have been opened with such force or violence that it was left in this state of permanent disorder. One might ask whether such force cool have been applied without awakening the occupant of the bed, particularly if that occupant was in the process of expiring." He turned to face Godfrey directly, his expression one of polite inquiry. "Tell me, was your wife a sound sleeper? Did she require assistance to rouse, or would external disturbances typically alert her?" Godfrey hesitated, and in that hesitation, Wimsey perceived the first genuine crack in the facade of grief. She was moderately sensitive to disturbance. A door slamming would wake her. Wind against the windows occasionally disturbed her rest. But if she had taken something for the migraine, laudanum, perhaps, she might have been more deeply asleep. "Might have," Wimsey repeated softly. "Did she take laudanum last evening, to your knowledge?" I cannot say with certainty. I was downstairs. She might have done." Wimsey's smile was thin as a blade. How very convenient. "And did the physician examine the bedside table, the decanter on the dresser, any glass that might indicate she had consumed medication or drink?" Godfrey's face had paled to a shade approaching the damask curtains. "I don't believe that is, Inspector Gresham may have noted such things, but I was not attending closely." "No," said Wimsey, turning back to the body with an expression of profound concentration. "I suspect you were not. Which raises the rather pressing question of what you were, in fact, attending to." The silence that followed Wimsey's observation was the sort of silence that possessed weight and consequence, the variety that accumulates in rooms where uncomfortable truths have been inadvertently articulated. Godfrey's complexion shifted through several fascinating gradations, from pale cream to a rather alarming shade of grey-white, rather reminiscent of the discoloration visible upon his late wife's features. His hands, which had been clasped before him, an attitude of suppressed anxiety, now trembled with sufficient violence that he appeared compelled to seat himself upon the edge of a nearby chair. "I was downstairs," he repeated, but the conviction had drained from his voice like color from silk exposed to excessive sunlight. "Reading. I was reading in the library. One can ask the servants. They saw me there." "Naturally they did," Wimsey replied with the gentle firmness of a man accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. "The question is not whether you were visible to the servants, but rather whether you were occupied in the manner you have described. Servants, in my experience, possess a remarkable capacity for observing that one is present in a room without necessarily observing what one is doing whilst present. A man reading a book and a man engaged in some other activity might present an identical silhouette to the casual observer. He moved away from the body with apparent unconcern and commenced a systematic examination of the room's contents. The bedside table held precisely what one might anticipate: a lamp, a small glass, empty, he noted, and bearing traces of what appeared to be dried liquid, and a leather-bound volume of rather obscure poetry. The dresser presented a similar landscape of domesticity: hairbrushes, a hand mirror, a modest selection of cosmetics arranged with the precision of someone accustomed to order. The wardrobe, when opened, revealed garments of respectable quality but conservative design, suggesting a woman whose ambitions in matters of fashion extended no further than the achievement of appropriate propriety. "Tell me about your wife's disposition," Whimsy said, his voice acquiring that particular quality it assumed when examining evidence that had already proven itself unreliable. "Was she given to melancholy? Did she complain of her existence, her marriage, her station? Was she the sort of woman inclined toward dramatic gestures or the consumption of substances not strictly prescribed by medical practitioners?" Godfrey, recovering somewhat from his initial shock, drew himself upright. Beatrice was entirely conventional, dutiful. She managed the household with admirable efficiency. She was not the sort of woman given to dramatics or excess. She was, if I may say so, rather dull. "How refreshingly honest," Whimsy observed, "though I confess I find such characterizations of the deceased somewhat suspect. One tends to discover, upon closer examination, that the apparently dull often possessed depths considerably more interesting than their surviving acquaintances were prepared to acknowledge. Dullness, in my experience, frequently masks the existence of secrets." He retrieved the glass from the bedside table and examined it with renewed interest, holding it to the light that filtered through the open curtains. "This glass has contained a liquid of some viscosity. The residue suggests either laudanum, as you hypothesized, or possibly something considerably more efficacious. Did your wife possess a particular fondness for any specific beverages? Port? Sherry? Some herbal tisane of her own preparation?" "She took chamomile before bed," Godfrey replied, the information emerging with the reluctance of a man uncertain whether such details might prove incriminating. "A simple infusion. Nothing unusual. And did she prepare this infusion herself?" "No. The housemaid brought it up. She always did. Mrs. Carmichael, our housekeeper, insisted upon maintaining certain standards regarding the evening beverages." Whimsy's eyebrow ascended with the deliberate precision of a man whose attention had just been directed towards something of significance. "The housekeeper prepared the beverage? How very thorough of her. And is this Mrs. Carmichael of the sort to maintain exhaustive records regarding such domestic details? Or does she merely execute her duties with the functional competence one expects from someone in her position?" "She's been with us for 12 years, Godfrey said. "Entirely reliable, beyond reproach. I cannot imagine—" "Imagination is often an inadequate guide to reality," Whimsy interrupted pleasantly. "I should very much like to speak with this paragon of domestic virtue. But before we descend to the servants' quarters, might I examine the remainder of this chamber? One never knows what details might prove illuminating." He conducted a circuit of the room with the meticulous precision of a man cataloguing the architecture of a crime. He examined the fireplace, noting the arrangement of ash and the condition of the grate. He inspected the carpet for any disturbance or displacement of fibers. He opened drawers with careful deliberation, observing their contents and the manner in which they had been organized. It was only when he reached the dressing table that something appeared to capture his full attention. Tucked beneath the edge of the mirror, partially concealed by the arrangement of cosmetics, was a small envelope. It bore no markings on its exterior, but when Whimsy extracted it with 2 fingers held delicately, as though the paper might dissolve at excessive pressure, he discovered that it contained several banknotes of considerable denomination and a brief note written in what appeared to be Beatrice's own hand. "My dear," Whimsy said softly, holding the note toward the light, "I find myself increasingly curious about your late wife's financial arrangements. These notes represent a sum of approximately £150, a rather substantial quantity of currency for a woman whose husband has, by his own admission, controlled her household budget with CU. Stomery, husbandly authority. One might ask how she came to possess such a sum, and more significantly, what she intended to accomplish with it." Godfrey stared at the envelope with the expression of a man observing a snake materialize from beneath his morning newspaper. His jaw worked silently, and when he finally managed to articulate words, they emerged in barely controlled tones. I had no knowledge of that. Beatrice never. She would not have accumulated funds without your knowledge? Whimsy finished delicately. How curious that you should find this surprising, given that you have already admitted to leaving her unattended, whilst you engaged in undisclosed activities in the library. One begins to suspect that Beatrice Harrington West possessed considerably more agency and considerably more secrets than her husband was prepared to acknowledge. A state of affairs that raises several rather pressing questions regarding motive, opportunity, and the essential nature of their domestic arrangement. He folded the note with deliberate care and placed it in his pocket. I believe, dear fellow, that we have only begun to excavate the truth of this matter. The descent from the master bedroom to the servants' quarters proceeded in a silence that suggested Godfrey had begun to appreciate the distinction between requesting assistance from a detective and actually receiving it. Whimsy maintained a cheerful demeanor throughout the journey, humming a fragmentary passage from Schubert whilst negotiating the narrow corridor that led toward the domestic areas of the house. It was precisely the sort of behavior calculated to unsettle a guilty conscience, though whether Godfrey possessed such a thing remained, in Whimsy's estimation, a matter requiring considerably more evidence than had thus far been presented. Mrs. Carmichael emerged from the servants' hall with the precise timing of someone who had been anticipating the interruption. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with the sort of face that suggested she had spent her life in the maintenance of standards and the suppression of personal opinion. Her grey hair was contained in an immaculate coif, her apron was pristine to the point of architectural precision, and her expression communicated a degree of disapproval toward the general disorder created by the presence of death in one's household. Mrs. Carmichael, Whimsy commenced, extending his hand with a charm that appeared to perplex her considerably. I am Lord Peter Whimsy, and I find myself possessed of several queries regarding the events of last evening. Your reputation for competence precedes you, and I should be most grateful for your assistance in clarifying certain particulars. The housekeeper, momentarily disarmed by this unexpected courtesy, shook his hand with the tentative grip of someone uncertain whether the gesture was appropriate. My lord, she replied, her voice carrying the careful enunciation of someone whose position depended upon the maintenance of proper forms. I'm afraid I cannot speak to matters beyond my purview. The master has engaged someone, and I defer entirely to his judgment. How admirably subordinate of you, Whimsy observed, though I confess that I have found, throughout my admittedly irregular career, that those in positions of domestic authority often possess insights that supersede the observations of those nominally in charge. You, for instance, would necessarily have observed your mistress's habits with far greater intimacy than her husband could possibly have maintained. Tell me, did Mrs. Harrington West exhibit any unusual behaviors in the days preceding her death? Any deviation from established routine? Mrs. Carmichael's expression suggested she was attempting to navigate some particularly complex moral terrain. I would not presume to comment upon the mistress's private affairs, my lord. Naturally not, Whimsy agreed, but I am not inquiring regarding private affairs, merely observable facts. For instance, was she in receipt of any unusual correspondence? Did she appear anxious or distressed? Did her appetite diminish? Did she venture from the house at irregular hours? These are matters of simple household observation, not speculation regarding intimate matters. The housekeeper hesitated, and in that hesitation Whimsy perceived the presence of something. Whether knowledge, suspicion, or merely professional discretion remained to be determined. The mistress received a letter, she said finally, her voice reduced to barely more than a murmur. 3 days ago, from London. She appeared troubled by it. She kept to her room for the remainder of the day. It was unlike her. How very interesting, Whimsy murmured. And this letter, do you recall its origin? The postmark, the hand in which it was addressed? I did not examine it closely, my lord. Such would be improper. But I observed that it arrived in the Morning Post and the hand appeared unfamiliar. Not regular correspondence. And your mistress's reaction upon receiving it? She went quite pale. I offered to bring her tea, and she declined. She asked specifically that she not be disturbed for the remainder of the day. She dined in her room, which was most unusual. The mistress always observed proper dining hours. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Godfrey, whose expression suggested he was encountering information that contradicted his established narrative with considerable force. How fascinating. And did your mistress exhibit any indication of what had distressed her? Did she discuss the letter with Mr. Harrington West? Not to my knowledge, my lord. The master was occupied with Matt. R.S. in his study. The mistress kept to herself. And last evening, Mrs. Carmichael, did you personally prepare the chamomile infusion that was delivered to your mistress's chamber? The housekeeper's expression shifted subtly. I did, my lord, as the first do every evening. The mistress was particular about her beverages. She preferred that I prepare them myself rather than delegating to the housemaid. How very conscientious, Whimsy observed. And the chamomile, where is it sourced? Do you maintain your own supply, or is it procured from local merchants? From the herbalist in the village, my lord. Mrs. Fletcher on the High Street. I have been purchasing from her for 8 years. The quality is invariably consistent. And you added nothing unusual to the infusion last evening. No additional herbs for medicinal purposes. No sugar or honey beyond the customary preparation. Mrs. Carmichael's jaw tightened perceptibly. Certainly not, my lord. I prepare the infusion precisely as I have prepared it for the past 12 years. The mistress's instructions were explicit regarding consistency. Remarkable, Whimsy said softly. So remarkable, in fact, that I find myself wondering whether your explicit adherence to established procedure might serve as the most effective disguise for deviation from it. Tell me, and I ask this with no presumption of impropriety, did you observe your mistress consume the infusion after it was delivered? I did not, my lord. I delivered it and withdrew, as was proper. As was proper, Whimsy echoed. How very convenient that propriety should demand precisely the degree of absence necessary to prevent observation. Mrs. Carmichael, I must ask you directly, were you aware of any financial difficulties affecting the household? Any pressures or concerns that might have motivated unusual actions on the part of any household member? The housekeeper's composu, which had been maintained with admirable consistency throughout the interrogation, suddenly fractured. Her eyes fixed upon some point beyond Whimsy's immediate vicinity, and when she spoke her voice carried the weight of suppressed information demanding release. There were debts, my lord, the master's debts. I should not know of such matters, but one hears things when attending to household accounts. The solicitors have been writing regarding matters that require settlement. There was discussion of entailments and complications regarding the mistress's inheritance. Godfrey made an abrupt movement, as though to protest, but Whimsy raised a single finger with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. How very interesting. And this inheritance, was Mrs. Harrington West in receipt of independent income prior to her death? Her father's estate, my lord. Settled upon her at her marriage. The master managed it, but it was legally hers. £300 per annum, no inconsiderable sum. The implications of this revelation manifested themselves across Godfrey's features with the velocity of a lightning strike striking exposed nerve tissue. Whimsy regarded him with an expression of sympathetic curiosity, as though observing a man who had suddenly comprehended the precise dimensions of his own predicament. How very revealing, Whimsy said finally. I begin to suspect that Tuesday has delivered considerably more than anticipated. The library, when they returned to it some 20 minutes later, presented the appearance of a room that had been subjected to considerable professional scrutiny. Inspector Gresham, a man of perhaps 55 years, with the sort of face that suggested chronic disappointment with the world's general resistance to straightforward solutions, had apparently conducted his preliminary examination with a thoroughness one expect from someone of limited imaginative capacity. Papers were scattered across the mahogany desk with the careless abandon of official investigation, and the curtains had been drawn back to admit the pale December light. Gresham himself occupied a leather chair with the attitude of a man settling in for a lengthy occupation, his notebook open before him and his expression suggesting that he had been awaiting Whimsy's arrival with something approaching dread. The local constabulary, Whimsy had long ago concluded, harbored a particular antipathy toward the involvement of private investigators, particularly those possessed of titles and the sort of public reputation that tended to overshadow official procedure. Lord Wimsey, Gresham commenced, rising with the reluctant politeness one might extend toward an acknowledged superior. Mr. Harrington West has informed me of your engagement in this matter. I confess I am not entirely certain what assistance you believe you might render, given that the death appears straightforward enough. A woman of advancing years, a probable heart seizure or stroke, and certain discoloration that the physician has attributed to post-mortem pooling of blood. There is nothing that suggests criminal intervention at this juncture. How reassuring, Wimsey replied, settling himself into a chair positioned to command a view of both Gresham and the room's contents. And yet I find myself troubled by several particulars that seem to have escaped your official attention. The open shutter, for instance, the locked window, the mysterious envelope containing £150, the unexplained letter received 3 days prior to the decease. These are details that strike me as marginally inconsistent with a straightforward natural expiration. Gresham's expression suggested that he was attempting to determine whether Wimsey was being deliberately obtuse or merely theatrical. The shutter is hardly conclusive, sir. Houses settle, wind disturbs fixtures, servants move things about. As for the letter and the money, these are matters of private domestic concern and do not necessarily bear upon the question of how your man's wife came to expire. My man, Wimsey's eyebrow assented with the deliberate precision of a man engaged in subtle correction. Inspector, I believe you labor under a misapprehension regarding the nature of my employment. I was engaged by Mr. Harrington West, certainly, but I do not serve as his advocate or his tool. I serve rather as an instrument of truth-seeking, which is a considerably more impartial enterprise. Tell me, has the post-mortem examination been scheduled? For tomorrow morning at the county hospital, Gresham replied, his tone suggesting that this detail had been omitted from earlier discourse with deliberate precision. The coroner has been notified, though given the absence of visible trauma or apparent toxicological indications, I suspect the verdict will be natural causes. How very convenient, Wimsey observed. And has anyone examined the contents of the bedroom in detail? The bedside table, the wardrobe, the dressing table, all the intimate spaces where a woman of Beatrice's apparent reserve might have concealed matters of personal significance? The room has been observed, Gresham replied, with an irritability that suggested his professional patience was approaching exhaustion. Nothing unusual has been noted beyond what one might anticipate in any bedroom of similar station. I fail to perceive the necessity for exhaustive examination. Wimsey rose and moved toward the desk, where several items had been catalogued with minimal clarity. Among them lay what appeared to be a partially consumed bottle of laudanum, its label bearing the name of a London chemie. "Saint and this?" he inquired, retrieving the bottle with the delicacy one might employ when handling something of considerable evidentiary value. "Was this present in the bedroom, or has it originated from some other location?" Gresham consulted his notes with an air of affected indifference. "Found in the wardrobe, sir, apparently prescribed to the deceased some months ago for management of her migraines. The physician indicated that such usage was not uncommon among women of her generation." "Quite so," Wimsey agreed, "though I find myself curious regarding the quantity consumed versus the quantity remaining. If I calculate correctly, this bottle should contain approximately 3 ounces, yet it appears to contain perhaps half that quantity. One might ask whether Beatrice had been consuming the laudanum with considerably more regularity than medical advisement might suggest, or whether someone had depleted the supply for purposes beyond her direct consumption." "You are speculating, sir, without evidence." "On the contrary," Wimsey replied smoothly, "I am observing facts and drawing logical conclusions from them, a distinction your methods appear to conflate with regrettable consistency. Now then, I should very much like to examine Mr. Harrington West's financial records, his solicitor's correspondence, his banking statements, any documents relating to the management of his wife's inheritance. These particulars would illuminate considerably the question of motive, which I find to be rather more illuminating than post-mortem discoloration or the general properties of laudanum." Gresham's expression suggested that he was wrestling with the question of whether to eject Whimsy from the investigation entirely or to accede to his demands with ill grace. The latter course apparently proved victorious, though the inspector's tone suggested no particular satisfaction with T. He decision, "Very well, sir. The correspondence is in the desk second drawer. I have perused it myself and found nothing extraordinary. Matters of routine household expense, and one letter from the family solicitor regarding certain complications with the estate entailment. Nothing that suggests criminal activity." Whimsy extracted the documents with methodical precision and began examining them in the manner of someone engaged in archaeological excavation. It was only when he reached the letter from the solicitor, dated 5 days prior to Beatrice's death, that something appeared to capture his full attention. "Ah," he murmured softly. "How very illuminating indeed." "Inspector, I find myself wondering whether you read this letter with adequate comprehension. It appears that Mr. Harrington West's financial difficulties have exceeded what one might term the merely embarrassing, and have instead achieved a state of absolute crisis. His wife's inheritance cannot be touched without her consent, and certain creditors have begun to pursue legal remedies. In short, the man was facing financial ruin unless his wife suddenly became considerably more cooperative regarding the disposition of her funds, or considerably more deceased." Godfrey, who had been maintaining a strategic silence throughout this interrogation, began to protest, but Whimsy raised a hand with the authority of someone whose attention had already moved beyond the man's immediate objections. "Tell me, Godfrey," Whimsy said quietly, turning to face his reluctant client directly, "what precisely were you doing in the library last evening, between 9:30 and 11 o'clock? The silence that followed this question was absolute and encompassing, the silence of a man watching the architecture of his constructed narrative collapse with the inevitability of a house of cards exposed to a sudden draught. Godfrey's NDS trembled with sufficient violence that he was compelled to grasp the edge of the nearest chair for support. His face, which had achieved various shades of pallor throughout the investigation, now acquired the quality of old parchment, dry, brittle, and on the verge of disintegration. When he finally managed to articulate words, they emerged in the hesitant cadences of a man confessing matters he had hoped never to voice aloud. "I was writing," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into still water, "letters to the creditors, attempting to negotiate extensions on the payments due. I could not face the prospect of explaining to Beatrice that everything was lost, that her inheritance would be consumed in paying off my debts, that I had been such a catastrophic failure as a husband and as a man of affairs." "How very touching," Whimsy observed, his tone suggesting that he had encountered this particular variety of moral cowardice with sufficient frequency to regard it with something approaching philosophical detachment. "And yet your presence in the library, however occupied with matters of correspondence, does not address the essential question. Did you or did you not ascend to the master bedroom at any point during the evening?" "No." The word emerged with the desperation of a man grasping at whatever threads of truth might redeem his situation. "I remained downstairs the entire evening. I did not see Beatrice after she retired. I could not have what, precisely?" Whimsy interrupted, his voice acquiring that particular quality it assumed when extracting confession from reluctant witnesses. "Administered the laudanum? Opened the shutter? Witnessed the manner of her expiration? Come now, Godfrey, let us cease this performance of injured innocence. You have already demonstrated yourself capable of considerable dishonesty regarding your financial circumstances and your wife's knowledge thereof. Why should we now accept your protestations of innocence regarding the matter at hand?" Inspector Gresham, observing this exchange with the expression of a man witnessing a theatrical performance of marginally higher quality than he had anticipated, consulted his notebook with renewed interest. "I confess, Lord Whimsy, that I begin to perceive certain difficulties with the narrative as initially presented." "Mr. Harrington West, do you wish to revise your statement regarding your whereabouts last evening?" Godfrey rose from his chair with the abruptness of a man suddenly seized by the necessity of motion. He moved toward the window, positioning himself in profile against the pale winter light, a silhouette of defeat rendered in human form. "I did go upstairs," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "but not to see Beatrice. I went to her room, to her dressing room, because I intended to examine her correspondence privately. I knew she had received a letter 3 days prior, and I thought perhaps she had received another. I thought there might be some indication of what was troubling her, some suggestion that she might be inclined toward cooperation regarding the financial matters." "How very considerate of you," Whimsy observed. "And did you find what you sought?" "I found her asleep," Godfrey replied, "or what I believe to be sleep. She appeared to be resting peacefully. I did not disturb her. I examined her correspondence. There was nothing of significance, and I withdrew. I did not touch her. I did not give her anything. When I came back to bed nearly 2 hours later, she was already cold. I assumed she had had an apoplexy or some cardiac event. I was frightened. I did not know what to do." "And the shutter?" Whimsy pressed, his eyes narrowing with the intensity of a man pursuing a quarry that had begun to reveal itself in unexpected dimensions. "How did the shutter come to be open?" "I opened it," Godfrey whispered. "When I realized she was dead, I panicked. I thought if I opened the window, if I created the appearance of something irregular, it might suggest that something external had occurred, something beyond my involvement. I opened the shutter, and then immediately closed the window again, locking it." It was a moment of absolute madness. I did not think. I merely reacted. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Inspector Gresham, and in that exchange an understanding appeared to materialize, the recognition that they were confronted not with the perpetrator of the crime, but rather with a man whose guilt lay not in commission, but in the far more complex arena of profound negligence and psychological manipulation. "How many hours had she been deceased before you discovered her?" Whimsy inquired, his tone acquiring the clinical precision of someone engaged in the reconstruction of a timeline. "The physician estimated between 3 and 5 hours, so she would have expired sometime between 6 and 8 o'clock, whilst I was still downstairs." "And you detected nothing? No sound, no indication, no disturbance that might have alerted you to the fact that your wife was expiring in the room directly above?" "The library is heavily insulated," Godfrey replied, his voice hollow, "and I was occupied with my correspondence. I heard nothing." Whimsy rose and moved toward the window, his gaze directed toward the exterior wall where the open shutter still hung in its position of disorder. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had begun to perceive the essential architecture of events with sufficient clarity to anticipate what must follow. "Inspector Gresham, I find myself possessed of a rather urgent necessity to examine the contents of that letter Mrs. Carmichael mentioned, the one received 3 days prior to the death. I suspect it may prove to be considerably more illuminating than any of the matters we have thus far discussed. Moreover, I believe we would be well advised to speak with the herbalist in the village, the chemist who supplied the chamomile. I have a rather pressing suspicion that Mrs. Carmichael's testimony regarding her preparation methods may have been delivered with somewhat more literal precision than one might initially have assumed." "You believe the housekeeper is responsible?" Gresham asked, his professional skepticism beginning to yield to the force of logical deduction. "I believe," Whimsy replied softly, "that we are only beginning to comprehend the full dimensions of this tragedy. But before we proceed further, I should very much like to know precisely what that letter contained, and to whom Mrs. Beatrice Harrington West was writing that mysterious correspondence. Because I suspect, dear fellow, that the victim in this matter was considerably less passive than her death might suggest. The village of Ashford possessed that particular quality of rural English settlements, a high street of reasonable width, a church of medieval antiquity, and several establishments of commerce arranged with the apparent randomness of people who had never considered that their arrangement might be improved through systematic planning. The herbalist's shop occupied a narrow storefront between the post office and a greengrocer's establishment, its windows displaying an assortment of dried plants and mysterious bottles that suggested either considerable expertise or elaborate charlatanism. Mrs. Fletcher, the proprietor, emerged from the interior of her establishment with the alacrity of someone accustomed to the arrival of visitors bearing questions. She was a woman of perhaps 70 years, with bright eyes that suggested an intellect considerably more acute than her somewhat vague manner might initially suggest. Her hands, when extended in greeting, bore the stains of long association with botanical matter and possessed the strength of someone accustomed to grinding and measuring substances of considerable potency. "Lord Wimsey," she said, appearing to recognize him through some mechanism of village intelligence that made formal introduction. "Unnecessary. I had wondered when someone of your reputation might arrive in our little community. There has been considerable discussion regarding the unfortunate death of Mrs. Harrington West. Most irregular, most distressing. Do come inside. I have recently prepared a tisane that I find particularly restorative at this time of year." "How gracious," Wimsey replied, stepping into an interior that assailed the senses with the accumulated aromatics of decades of botanical accumulation. Bunter, who had been waiting patiently in the motorcar, received a discreet gesture suggesting that his services would not be required for this particular interview. "I find myself possessed of several queries regarding your supply arrangements with the Harrington West household. Specifically, the chamomile which Mrs. Carmichael has been procuring from you for approximately 8 years. The sourcing, the processing, the consistency of supply. These are matters I should very much like to understand." Mrs. Fletcher moved behind her counter with the fluid grace of someone engaging in a familiar choreography. "The chamomile is cultivated in my garden," she explained, her tone suggesting that such information was both straightforward and unremarkable. Dried and packaged according to Mrs. Carmichael's specifications. She was very particular regarding the preparation, the drying temperature, the storage conditions, the absence of any additional botanicals. Rather excessive in her requirements, if I may be frank, but I accommodated her wishes without deviation. "And has Mrs. Carmichael ever requested modifications to this arrangement?" Wimsey inquired, his eyes moving across the shelves of bottles and dried matter with the careful attention of someone cataloguing evidence. "Additions to the chamomile? Supplementary substances disguised within the standard preparation?" Mrs. Fletcher's expressio N shifted, not substantially, but with sufficient clarity to suggest that Wimsey had approached uncomfortably close to matters she had been entertaining considerable internal debate regarding. "I cannot speak to such matters," she said finally, her voice acquiring the careful precision of someone choosing words with deliberation. "A proprietor of an establishment such as this maintains certain discretions regarding the requests of clientele. Some matters are best left unexamined." "How very diplomatic," Wimsey observed, "and yet I find myself possessed of an urgent necessity to examine precisely such matters. A woman has expired under circumstances that remain somewhat ambiguous. A post-mortem examination is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If certain facts regarding the composition of substances administered to the deceased prior to her expiration were to emerge at that examination, they would prove considerably more damaging to you than any voluntary disclosure you might care to make at this juncture." Mrs. Fletcher was silent for an extended moment, her gaze fixed upon some point beyond the immediate geography of her shop. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone confessing matters that had been weighing upon her conscience with considerable force. "3 weeks ago," she commenced, "Mrs. Carmichael came to me with a most unusual request. She asked if I could supply her with a substance, a very particular substance, that might be introduced into Mrs. Harrington West's evening infusion without detection. Something that would produce the appearance of natural expiration whilst causing no external trauma or obvious signs of poisoning. She was quite specific in her requirements. She emphasized that the substance must be tasteless, odorless, and rapid in its action." "And did you comply with this request?" Wimsey asked, though the question was large. Lie rhetorical, the confirmation already evident in Mrs. Fletcher's anguished expression. "I supplied her with a preparation derived from certain Himalayan fungi," Mrs. Fletcher admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "A substance that produces cardiac depression and respiratory failure when introduced in quantities exceeding a certain threshold. It is not easily detected in post-mortem examination because it decomposes rapidly in human tissue. I believed it was for herself, that she was contemplating some final solution to private distresses. I did not imagine she intended it for another. How very convenient a belief, Whimsy observed, his tone cutting through the woman's self-exculpation with surgical precision. And did Mrs. Carmichael explain her reasoning for this request? Did she elaborate regarding her motivations? She spoke of injustice, Mrs. Fletcher replied, of a woman who had been treated abominably, whose life had become unbearable through the negligence and cruelty of a man who claimed to love her. She spoke of a wrong that required correction and of her inability to witness further suffering. Whimsy turned away from the herbalist and moved toward the window, his silhouette rendered in sharp profile against the pale winter light. "And has Mrs. Carmichael collected payment for this arrangement? Has she provided you with compensation for your participation in what amounts to conspiracy to commit murder?" "No," Mrs. Fletcher whispered. "She said nothing of payment. She merely said that I had done a kindness, that I had assisted in preventing considerable future suffering." "How very curious," Whimsy murmured. "A murder committed not for financial gain, not for revenge in the conventional sense, but rather as an act of mercy. A housemaid conspiring with an herbalist to remove from this world a woman whose existence had apparently becco. Intolerable. Tell me, Mrs. Fletcher, did Mrs. Carmichael ever speak directly with you regarding the specific nature of Mrs. Harrington West's sufferings? Did she elaborate beyond vague references to injustice and cruelty?" Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, and in that hesitation, Whimsy perceived the presence of additional information, knowledge that the woman was struggling to determine whether she possessed any right to withhold. "She spoke of a child," Mrs. Fletcher said finally, "a daughter, Mrs. Carmichael's granddaughter. The girl had been in service at the household before Mrs. Harrington West dismissed her some years ago, dismissed her under circumstances that suggested impropriety. The girl was sent away, her reputation destroyed. She died not 6 months later in a workhouse of consumptive disease. Mrs. Carmichael has carried that grief and that rage for more than 5 years. She believed that Mrs. Harrington West bore responsibility for the girl's death. She believed that, by removing the woman from this world, she was preventing further casualties of the same indifference and cruelty." Whimsy remained silent for an extended moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that suggested he had confronted a moral complexity considerably more intricate than the mechanics of poisoning. "Inspector Gresham," he said quietly, turning back toward the motor car where the constable had remained in patient attendance, "I believe you will need to take Mrs. Fletcher into custody, and I fear we must return to the Harrington West household with considerably less certainty regarding the nature of justice than we possessed when we departed." The return journey to the Harrington West residence proceeded in a silence that possessed considerably more weight than the drive toward Ashford. Inspector Gresham, following in his own motor car with Mrs. Fletcher in custody, had begun to appreciate the distinction between the mechanical investigation of facts and the considerably more complex enterprise of understanding human motivation. Whimsy, meanwhile, appeared to be engaged in some form of internal calculation, his gaze fixed upon the passing countryside with the intensity of a man attempting to perceive patterns in apparent randomness. It was only when they had returned to the house and Inspector Gresham had made arrangements for Mrs. Fletcher's temporary detention that Whimsy proceeded directly to the servants' quarters, bypassing the drawing-room where Godfrey had been left to contemplate the ruins of his carefully constructed fiction. Mrs. Carmichael was discovered in her small sitting-room, engaged in the precise folding of household linens with a mechanical precision that suggested her hands were occupied, whilst her mind remained elsewhere entirely. She did not appear surprised at Whimsy's entrance, nor did she manifest the panic or resistance one might anticipate from someone whose criminal conspiracy had been exposed. Instead, she merely set aside the linen with careful deliberation and rose to face him with the composure of someone who had been anticipating precisely this confrontation. "You know," Whimsy said, positioning himself with his back to the fireplace in a posture that conveyed both authority and a peculiar species of sympathetic understanding. "You know that Mrs. Fletcher has disclosed the essential facts of your arrangement. You know that a post-mortem examination will likely confirm the presence of the fungal compound in Mrs. Harrington West's tissues. You know that the law will regard your actions as conspiracy to commit murder, regardless of the motivations that prompted them. And yet you appear possessed of a certain tranquility that suggests you have made peace with these inevitable consequences. Tell me, was it worth it? Mrs. Carmichael's expression, weathered by decades of maintaining proper deference, shifted into something considerably more complex. Her eyes, when they met Whimsy's directly, carried a depth of sorrow and rage that years of service had merely concealed rather than eliminated. My granddaughter was 16 years old, she said quietly. 14 when she came into service here. She was a good girl, industrious, respectful. She did nothing to deserve what was done to her. When Mr. Harrington West began his attentions, she reported it to Mrs. Harrington West, believing the mistress would protect her. Instead, she was dismissed without reference, dismissed with the allegation that she had invited the master's attentions, dismissed with her reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. And Mrs. Harrington West was complicit in this injustice, Whimsy observed, not as a question, but as a statement of fact that required acknowledgement. She was worse than complicit, Mrs. Carmichael replied, her voice acquiring an edge of controlled bitterness. She protected him. She ensured he faced no consequences. She allowed a 16-year-old girl to be cast into the world with nothing but the label of a seductress. My Eleanor died in a workhouse ward, coughing blood into a stained pillow. She was 17 years old. She had committed no sin, except the sin of being young and vulnerable in a house where the master was permitted to do precisely as he wished. And you believed that Mrs. Harrington West's death would somehow rectify this injustice? Whimsy asked, his tone neither accusatory nor sympathetic, but rather engaged in the precise articulation of logical consequence. I believed that her death would prevent further girls from suffering the same fate, Mrs. Carmichael replied. I knew of at least 2 other servants who had been subjected to similar attentions, and I knew that Mr. Harrington West would continue his predations for as long as he lived, because his wife would continue to enable him through her indifference and her complicity. Removing her from this equation was a mercy to her even. She was not a happy woman, Lord Whimsy. She knew what her husband was. She chose to ignore it in exchange for the security of her position. That choice poisoned her own soul. Whimsy moved toward the window, his gaze directed toward the external wall, where the now closed shutter represented the only remaining evidence of Godfrey's panicked attempt at misdirection. And yet your act of mercy has produced a rather unexpected consequence, he observed. The man you sought to constrain through his wife's death now stands to inherit her considerable fortune. Without her influence, however passive and complicit, he is entirely unfettered. Your intervention has not prevented future suffering, but rather ensured that the apparatus of that suffering will be considerably more efficiently operated. Mrs. Carmichael's jaw tightened, and for a moment the composure she had maintained appeared on the verge of fracturing entirely. I did not know, she said finally. I did not consider the financial implications. I merely sought to prevent further harm. How very human of you, Whimsy replied, his tone suggesting neither condemnation nor absolution, but rather the simple acknowledgement of tragic limitation. To pursue justice without adequately considering consequence. To believe that the removal of one malignant element would necessarily result in the improvement of a deeply corrupted system. To assume that your intervention would produce the outcome you desired rather than its precise opposite. He turned back to face Mrs. Carmichael directly, and his expression carried a complexity that suggested he had perceived dimensions of the situation that extended considerably beyond the mechanical facts of the crime itself. Inspector Gresham will take you into custody. A magistrate will be engaged. A trial will follow, in which the full circumstances of your granddaughter's treatment will emerge. And the verdict, I suspect, will be guilty as charged, despite the profound injustice that motivated your actions. That is the tragedy of law, Mrs. Carmichael. It operates according to mechanical principles, indifferent to the human suffering that prompts its violation. Will you tell them? Mrs. Carmichael asked quietly. About Eleanor? About what was done to her? I shall ensure that every detail of your granddaughter's suffering, every aspect of her treatment and her abandonment, is made abundantly evident to the court, Whimsy replied. Whether that knowledge will alter the verdict remains to be seen, but I can assure you of this much: her death will not be forgotten, and the complicity of this household in that death will not be permitted to pass without acknowledgement. He moved toward the door, then paused on the threshold. Inspector Gresham will be waiting. You should prepare yourself for departure. Mrs. Carmichael rose with dignity, and as she passed Whimsy in the doorway, she spoke with a voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty. It was worth it, she said, even knowing the consequences, even understanding that I have accomplished nothing but my own destruction. I would do it again, because Eleanor deserved better than this world gave her, and so did Mrs. Harrington West in her way. Whimsy watched her depart, and his expression suggested that he had encountered a truth that his carefully constructed systems of logic had not adequately prepared him to accommodate. The drawing room, when Whimsy finally descended to it some 40 minutes later, presented the appearance of a space that had absorbed considerable emotional turbulence. Godfrey occupied a chair positioned before the fireplace, with the posture of a man whose entire framework of existence had been subjected to systematic dismantling. His hands trembled as he lifted a glass of whiskey, his third, if Whimsy's estimate of the consumption pattern proved accurate, and his eyes possessed that particular quality of focused vacancy that suggested his consciousness had retreated to some interior landscape of private anguish. Inspector Gresham stood near the window, his expression one of professional satisfaction tempered by the emerging recognition that this case had produced considerably more complexity than initial observation had suggested. He turned as Whimsy entered, his notebook positioned with the anticipatory precision of someone preparing to record final statements of confession or clarification. "The housekeeper has been taken into custody," Gresham announced. "Mrs. Fletcher is similarly detained pending further investigation and coroner's determination. The post-mortem examination is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I confess, Lord Whimsy, that I find myself somewhat bewildered regarding the precise nature of this crime and the motivations underlying it. A woman murdered by her own servant in an act of misguided mercy. A husband ignorant of the poisoning, yet guilty of far more damaging negligence. A herbalist complicit in the administration of death. The circumstances defy conventional categorization. Most crimes do," Whimsy replied, settling himself into a chair with the ease of someone who had concluded his investigative labor and now occupied the leisure of retrospection. "The law prefers them to be tidy, prefers perpetrator clearly identifiable, motive comprehensible, outcome logically explicable. Reality, however, persists in its refusal to conform to such preferences. We are confronted in this instance with a crime born of genuine moral conviction, executed by someone possessed of intimate knowledge regarding the victim's capacity to inspire such conviction, and motivated by considerations that extend far beyond the conventional parameters of criminal psychology." Godfrey looked up from his whiskey with an expression suggesting that he was attempting to process language in a foreign tongue. "I did not know," he said, his voice emerging with the hollow quality of a man repeating a mantra whose meaning had begun to elude him. "I did not know about Eleanor. I did not know about what had occurred. If I had known, I would have—" "What?" Whimsy interrupted, his tone carrying a sharpness that cut through Godfrey's attempted self-exoneration with surgical precision. "You would have what, precisely? Prevented your own predatory behavior? Restrained yourself from the systematic exploitation of vulnerable servants? Come now, Godfrey, let us cease this performance of injured innocence and examine the actual facts of your conduct. You seduced a child. You permitted her to be destroyed by your wife's complicity and society's indifference. You lived in comfort whilst she died in squalor. The fact that you were unconscious of your own culpability hardly constitutes a mitigation of the guilt itself." Godfrey's face acquired a shade of grey that suggested his body was contemplating the physical manifestation of his psychological collapse. "What will happen to me?" he asked quietly. "Will I be charged with something? Will I face trial?" "That remains to be determined," Whimsy replied. "Your legal liability is ambiguous. You did not administer the poison. You did not conspire toward its administration. You did not knowingly permit your wife's murder. From the perspective of English law, you are technically innocent of CR. Criminal charge. From the perspective of moral accountability, you are considerably more culpable than the woman who executed this act of supposed mercy. But the law, as I have observed on numerous occasions, operates according to mechanical principles indifferent to such considerations. He rose and moved toward the sideboard, where he poured himself a measure of sherry with the deliberate precision of someone engaging in ritual rather than genuine thirst. However, there remains a rather pressing matter that demands clarification before this case achieves its final resolution. Tell me, Godfrey, did you know about the letter that your wife received 3 days prior to her death? The correspondence that appeared to trouble her sufficiently to prompt her withdrawal to her chamber? Godfrey shook his head slowly. I did not. I attempted to find it when I entered her room last evening, but I discovered nothing. Whatever it contained, she must have destroyed it or concealed it elsewhere. How very convenient, Whimsy murmured. And yet I find myself wondering whether the letter in question might have originated not from external source, but rather from within this household itself. Mrs. Carmichael, for instance, might have possessed considerable motivation to communicate with her mistress regarding matters of profound moral consequence. Tell me, Inspector, did you find any evidence of written communication between Mrs. Carmichael and Mrs. Harrington West? Gresham consulted his notes with the deliberate precision of someone accessing information that had begun to acquire unexpected significance. There was a letter in the waste bin of the mistress's chamber, partially burned in the fireplace, but recovered sufficiently for examination. It was written in what appeared to be the housekeeper's hand. The content was extremely limited, merely a statement that certain truths regarding the treatment of a former servant had been discovered, and that Mrs. Harrington West possessed knowledge of injustices that had been perpetrated. The letter appeared to be a plea for acknowledgement and redress. It was signed only with the initials C. Precisely as I suspected, Whimsy observed, his expression suggesting confirmation of a hypothesis that had achieved the status of certainty. Mrs. Carmichael made a final appeal to her mistress's conscience. She sought, in essence, to provoke some response that might suggest the possibility of moral redemption, and Mrs. Harrington West responded by withdrawing to her chamber and burning the letter, a gesture that constituted, in Mrs. Carmichael's perception, a final confirmation that the woman was beyond all possibility of moral improvement or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He turned to face Godfrey directly, his expression containing an element of controlled rage. Your wife possessed the knowledge to effect change. She possessed the authority to prevent further harm. She chose instead to ignore a direct plea for justice from a woman who had served her faithfully for 12 years. That choice sealed her fate, not because she deserved to die. No one deserves to die for moral negligence, but because she had exhausted the patience of someone whose capacity for mercy had been reduced to nothing by years of witnessing injustice. What will you do? Godfrey asked, his voice barely audible. Will you ensure that these details emerge at trial? Will you expose all of this to public scrutiny? I shall do precisely what I do in every case, Whimsy replied. I shall furnish the constabulary with the complete facts as I have uncovered them. What use they make of those facts remains entirely their determination. But I should warn you, Godfrey, that public sympathy for Mrs. Carmichael is likely to be considerably more pronounced than sympathy for your wife. The story of a servant girl destroyed by her master's predation and the mistress's complicity will resonate through the courtroom with considerable force. You may find yourself regarded with considerably less favor by society than you currently anticipate. He set down his sherry glass and moved toward the door. I believe our business here is concluded. Inspector, I trust you will ensure that the post-mortem examination confirms the presence of the fungal compound. Without question, Gresham replied. Though I confess the case has acquired dimensions I had not anticipated. They always do, Whimsy observed. That is the essential tragedy of investigation. It reveals not merely the mechanics of crime, but the profound moral failures that underlie them. The trial, when it occurred some 6 weeks later in the Assizes Court at County Hall, proceeded with the ponderous inevitability of institutional machinery grinding through prescribed motions. The courtroom itself was constructed in that Victorian Gothic fashion that seemed designed to impress upon the accused the weight of justice, whilst simultaneously suggesting that justice bore a rather unfortunate resemblance to theatrical performance. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an array of judicial functionaries, arranged in ascending hierarchies of authority, combined to produce an effect that was simultaneously impressive and vaguely absurd. Whimsy attended the proceedings in the manner of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing entertainment, though the case had acquired sufficient public notoriety to draw considerable attention from press and public alike. The details of Eleanor's treatment had emerged with devastating clarity during the preliminary examination, and by the time the trial proper commenced, the narrative had shifted from simple murder to something more complex. The exposure of systematic predation, institutional complicity, and the crushing weight of social indifference. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. The fungal compound was confirmed present in Mrs. Harrington West's tissues. Mrs. Fletcher provided testimony regarding her supply of the substance, though she carefully distinguished between complicity and full culpability, suggesting that she had believed herself to be assisting in an act of personal desperation rather than homicide. Mrs. Carmichael's testimony, when she finally took the stand, was delivered with a composed dignity that seemed to elevate the proceedings into something approaching the realm of classical tragedy. She described Eleanor with a precision that transformed the abstract into the profoundly personal. She recounted the girl's hopes, her expectations, her innocence. She detailed the moment of discovery when Eleanor had reported the master's attentions to her mistress. She described the subsequent dismissal, the destruction of the girl's reputation, and the slow descent into workhouse destitution. When asked to explain her motivations, she looked directly at the assembled court with an expression that suggested she was addressing a jury of conscience rather than a collection of legal functionaries. "I sought to prevent suffering," she said simply, "to the extent that such prevention was possible. I did not imagine my intervention would accomplish redemption or justice. I merely sought to sever a thread that was poisoning everyone it touched. If that constitutes murder in the eyes of the law, then I am guilty. But I would submit that there are forms of guilt that precede and exceed anything the law is capable of addressing." The judge, a man of perhaps 70 years with the sort of face that suggested he had witnessed sufficient human depravity to regard individual transgressions with something approaching philosophical detachment, appeared momentarily discomposed by this statement. He recovered with admirable promptitude and instructed the jury to disregard any testimony that suggested moral justification for the act in question. Yet the jury, when they returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation, appeared to have grasped something beyond the mechanical facts of poisoning and premeditation. They returned a verdict of guilty, as the evidence compelled them to do, but with a recommendation for mercy that was sufficiently emphatic to suggest that conventional legal categories had begun to seem inadequate to the actual circumstances. The sentence, delivered by the judge with a gravity that suggested he was pronouncing something considerably more significant than mere legal consequence, was 14 years of penal servitude, considerably less severe than the maximum the crime theoretically permitted. As the constables led Mrs. Carmichael from the courtroom, she caught Whimsy's eye for a moment, and in that exchange, something approximating understanding appeared to materialize between them. Godfrey, who had appeared throughout the proceedings with the disheveled appearance of a man whose existence had been thoroughly dismantled, departed the courtroom immediately following the verdict. The inheritance that had accrued to him upon his wife's death remained legally his, though public opinion had rendered it something approaching a curse. Within 3 months he had sold the Harrington West residence and relocated to the continent, apparently to escape the particular quality of social ostracism that British society reserves for those whose private conduct has been exposed to public scrutiny. Inspector Gresham, encountering Whimsy outside the courtroom as proceedings concluded, appeared to be wrestling with questions that extended considerably beyond his usual professional purview. "A strange business, Lord Whimsy," he observed. "I confess I find myself uncertain whether justice has been accomplished or merely performed. The woman who administered the poison has been sentenced to years of imprisonment, The man whose predatory behavior prompted the entire tragedy has escaped with his fortune intact. The victim, who was certainly no innocent, has been removed from this world. And the girl whose death initiated the sequence, Eleanor, remains dead, her suffering uncompensated, and her grave unmarked by any formal acknowledgement of her fate. "You perceive the essential tragedy with admirable clarity," Whimsy replied, his tone suggesting neither optimism nor despair, but rather a kind of weary acceptance. "Justice, as administered by law, operates according to mechanical principles. It can punish transgression. It cannot redeem suffering. It cannot restore the dead. It cannot even prevent the perpetuation of the systems that generate such suffering. All it can accomplish is the performance of consequence, the assurance that transgression does not pass entirely without acknowledgement. It is a modest achievement, yet it constitutes the entirety of what law can provide." He began to descend the courthouse steps, then paused and turned back toward Gresham. "However, I should note that certain institutions have begun to undertake investigations into the management practices of employment agencies in this region. Several former servants have come forward with allegations remarkably consistent with those detailed during this trial. Whether any tangible reform will emerge from such investigation remains to be determined. But the exposure of systematic wrongdoing, however incomplete the remedy, represents at least the possibility of future improvement. The motorcar journey back to London proceeded through a town, tri-side rendered uniform by winter's advancing severity. Bunter maintained his customary silence, though his expression suggested that he had perceived something in the trial's proceedings that engaged his moral sensibilities with considerable force. It was only as they approached the city's outer reaches that Whimsy spoke, his voice carrying the quality of someone thinking aloud rather than addressing another person. "Poor Eleanor," he murmured. "Poor Beatrice. Poor Mrs. Carmichael. All of them trapped within systems of exploitation and indifference against which individual resistance proved entirely inadequate. One endeavors to perceive some pattern of justice in such circumstances, some suggestion that the universe operates according to principles of moral coherence. And one inevitably fails. The universe, it appears, operates according to considerably more complex and considerably less comforting principles than such hope permits." He gazed out at the gathering dusk, where the first electric lights of London were beginning to assert themselves against the advancing darkness. "Still," he continued quietly, "there is this much to be said. The truth has been exposed. The mechanisms of oppression have been identified and acknowledged. Whether that constitutes victory, or merely the preliminary stage of an ongoing struggle, remains a question considerably beyond the purview of criminal investigation. I leave such philosophical considerations to others. My task, mercifully, has concluded." The motorcar drove on into the gathering night, carrying its passenger toward the comfortable insulation of London society, where such unpleasant truths might be safely compartmentalized and forgotten.